Thank you. Thank you, MIT. Thank you for the previous panel. Thank you, FCC. Thank you, Eugene. That was a tremendous, tremendously inspiring talk. And the previous panel, I'm still kind of caught up in it. I'm not sure what we're going to talk about, but let's just talk about open government still. That was great. But it was great in Eugene's talk to hear public media kind of called out in this way. Both, we're sort of used to in our travelings within the public media world to either be beating up on ourselves or patting our own back, and to hear it called out in a way that actually sets up a promise and a purpose within the context of the broadband plan, and to point the way to this discussion, which is going to try to talk about some of the challenges of this transition that we as an industry are in, and not dissimilar to some other media moments that are happening. So my name is Jake Shapiro. I'm Executive Director of PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. In many ways, we're one of these born digital new public media enterprises. We operate as an open distribution platform connecting independent producers with local stations, really as a hybrid between broadcast and digital opportunities, and trying to focus on the intersection of technology and talent, really trying to nurture new voices and content. And there's been a long-term interest in this topic of the transition of public broadcasting and public media into the participatory culture. We're at a nexus of opportunities. We see disruption in other media industries that we have observed in music in particular, which has been an interest of ours, and in newspapers that I know the Knight Foundation's report has really focused on where that's coming up. To Eugene's point about mediated versus unmediated, I think one of the themes I'm hoping will emerge from this conversation is if you take seriously the role of being a mediator still in this age, how are we addressing that through the public media system? A word about, when we're describing public media, there's definitional issues that are bound to come up. We have here with us really a group of public broadcasters. And in many ways, we're, I think, all discussing public media as radiating out from and well beyond the boundaries of what public broadcasting has traditionally been constituted to be, which can include, and has been referenced, public access television, low-power FMs, other nonprofits engaged in public service media activities. There's an interesting question, especially as we get into some of the opportunities ahead, as to where some of those boundaries end up getting drawn, especially as you talk about potential reform or even legislation that might change some of the definitions. So what I'd like to do, what's one thing about this panel is that rather than policymakers or policy observers or academics, we have a bunch of practitioners here who are really engaged in the day-to-day of building a next kind of public media architecture, infrastructure, operations across a spectrum of roles. So in order to get our heads around the opening of where this transition to a digital public media is headed, I'm going to ask each one to sort of introduce themselves, and in doing so, address the topic as they'd like, but also talk about a project or a particular initiative that is illustrative of what we think this next incarnation of public media might be. And I guess I'll just start to my left, so please introduce yourself, Rob.
Sure. Robert Bull. I'm with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and my role is to lead our digital strategy and investments. I think one of the central themes that I see, and I'm relatively new to public broadcasting. I came from an organization that worked in public media with low-income populations and then moved into this role about 10 months ago. And one of the great things that I see happening, one of the reasons why I was so attracted to coming over and working in public broadcasting is the two mediating influences. One was that you have the power to broadcast. The power to broadcast means that you can reach everyone in the United States with free, universally accessible content in general. And that is not necessarily true in the digital world, that digital content costs money to get access to and to utilize. So the ability to mix broadcast and digital platforms seemed to be a great opportunity for where public media is going. I also saw organizations and people like these that were starting to turn public media from a purely broadcast environment to a more of a platform approach, where there was other types of collaborations, other types of voices, and other types of opportunities to get information out into the world that are non-traditional. And so those two things are sort of in full swing. In terms of, I so desperately want to talk about the public media platform, but I know Kinsey's going to want to talk about that. But I want to talk about one thing that I think is a little unusual, or it's a little changing, and that is what some of the role of where PRX and where a number of other folks are in developing a series of very flexible applications, whether they're on mobile platforms or online, that allow people to engage and participate. WNYC is a good example of that in New York, that's doing work about sort of uncommon economic indicators, where they're actually asking people from the community to start to crowdsource knowledge about what's happening in their community. It's all centralized around a broadcast, a radio broadcast, but it is being visualized on the online space, which is generating even more broadcast. So that opportunity to really sort of have this engaged conversation in that space is really adding a great value, and it's an example of very flexible, very agile tools coming to bear in an industry, a broadcast industry, which can also mean a lot of capital and a lot of inflexibility because some of the rules around that broadcast. So there's a lot of very interesting sort of dynamic happening.
I'm Marita Rivero. I'm a vice president at WGBH, the public broadcaster here, and I'm the general manager for radio and television, which now means you're the general manager for mobile video, broadband, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I find this a moment of great opportunity and interest. So while we started in public broadcasting thinking about radio and television, it's been well over a decade since the work we've done really has moved on to create specific projects for many media devices and using many tools. So I think I'm here from the perspective of producers, kind of the editorial side of what's happening in public broadcasting. And Jake suggested I use as an example a large national project that we're beginning to work on called World 2.0, which is an online civic engagement project. We're really asking the public to help us define some of the issues of the day. And we're really looking at how we might target, in fact, I'll point a finger at 36, but a younger population of people, and put in front of that group opportunities to begin to become more engaged and share information about what's happening. When I was thinking about this, I wrote down 4 or 5 things that I think are distinctive as we as public broadcasters, the traditional public broadcasters, have engaged over this time. I think we use our strengths as curators. When we talk about news and journalism, news is the primary example of curation. And we're past grandmasters at taking very complicated issues and be able to present them back in ways that allow people to address them and digest them. Public broadcasters have a national base. As we've done work with many of the new media providers and partnered with new media providers, we realize one of the strengths we bring is that there are stations in communities all across the country. And being able to partner outside traditional public broadcasting means that we share a number of things, but one of them is that particular reach. We can use our current investments. That's what this project imagines. We put money into building the National Black Programming Consortium. And that consortium has connections with the African American community all across the country. There are opportunities for us to take investments that we've made in that and many other communities that we've developed over time and think about how we bring them back together, reformat them, using the capabilities we have now to have that voice part of the issues. Obviously, we're looking at creating a grammar that attracts people. That's what we do. We try to take some of the data and the things that might otherwise be dry and turn them into the possibility of bringing people in. If we can't do that, we're out of the business. And finally, I just say that we're looking at obviously right now a kind of transmedia and really distributed model of programming. So these are kind of 5 areas that I think some of them are unique to public broadcasters, established public broadcasting. But for us, they've all been part of what we've been experimenting with and what we're intending to bring into the World 2.0 project to look at a broader group of people coming together to empower themselves and talk about the issues of the day.
I'm Sue Shart. I'm the Executive Director of AIR, which is based here in Dorchester. It's the Association of Independents in Radio. It's an organization that's 21 years old. It's one of the oldest and largest professional membership organizations in public media. And what we have, is just briefly in terms of the organization, it's a very broad group spanning ages from about 18 to 70 years old. We have practitioners who have been in the business for 35 plus years who helped lay down the pipelines from the earliest days of the industry to the youngest and most emerging group of media practitioners. And hopefully we can talk more about that a little bit later. We had a project this last year, Maker's Quest 2.0, funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, that was a tremendous demonstration project. CPB came to us and asked us to help figure out how producers, how individual inspired producers could help lead the industry through the transition from public radio to public media. And what we saw emerge was really some just tremendous fodder and tremendous information and models for us. Briefly, I would invite you to look. There's a brief video at mq2.org, which will give you more of a scope on the projects. But briefly, what the principle behind the project is that the change is happening from the bottom up. It's individuals who are leading the change. It's the craftspeople who are leading, who are on the front edge of what's happening. And so what we did was we basically turned to them and, these nimble, not risk-averse, very crafty people who figure stuff out for a living, and said to them, how can we blend traditional platforms, the power of the converged audience that we have in public radio, which is tremendous, with these new this new circulation system, these new digital tools and pathways. We gave them 5 months. We gave them $40,000 each. And they came, I won't go into detail here, but what we saw come out of this were they invented new formats. Participatory documentary, they went into the communities. We partnered them each with incubators. So they were incubated, sort of seeded, 4 of them at NPR, 1 of them at KPCC in Los Angeles, 1 at KUOW in Seattle, WNYC. And so they had this relationship, but retained their independence and their freedom to invent. That's a project that I would say demonstrates the new face of the public media journalists, where we still see these gifted individuals, again, of varying degrees of experience, too. Some were very inexperienced, and some were much more experienced. But basically, in the role still, as Jake is mentioning, as a mediator, still the person who is gifted at identifying good stories and good storytellers, and then figuring out how to get that story out. But the whole landscape in terms of the tools that they can use is what's changed, and this is what they figured out. They don't have to go out with the microphone themselves and ask somebody a question and gather half an hour of tape and go back and cut it up into 4 minutes and, put it out on the radio station. It's a whole different participatory model. These are participatory models that they invented that are tremendously exciting.
Hi, I'm Kinsey Wilson. I'm Senior Vice President and General Manager of Digital Media at NPR, which means that about half of my time is spent sort of on the operations of NPR's digital media operations, and the other half is sort of gazing into the future and trying to figure out what NPR's future and its station's future digital strategy will be. I've been in journalism for 30 years, been in digital media for about 15, and like Rob, I'm relatively new to public media, having been there about 15 months. A couple of the speakers made reference to the enormous technological disruption that's going on. And for us, from where we sit, it's created both an imperative and an opportunity. The imperative Eugene referred to in terms of public broadcasting having to move from sort of its 20th century analog broadcasting model to its 21st century digital future and make sure that it can make that transition. The opportunity is one that I think has become much more evident just in the last couple of years as both the technological transformation has accelerated and the challenges to the business model around journalism have become accentuated. And we see an opportunity that one of our board members at a meeting the other day summed up as saying that we need stronger, more vibrant news organizations in more places. I would add to that reach larger and more diverse audiences across all platforms. It's an ambition that even just a couple of years ago probably would have been beyond the scope of public media, but because the technologies and the tools have become lighter and because monopoly or near monopoly news organizations that completely dominated the local market are beginning to see their franchise erode, and the opportunity is opening up for lots of different players to come in. There is a real opportunity for public media to step into that space. So our efforts have been focused really in two directions to try and help stations figure out what the best opportunity is in that space and where the appropriate divide is, if you will, between services and guidance that can be provided at a national level and economies of scale that can be provided at a national level, and where the opportunity is best left to the bottom-up kind of creativity that Sue was describing. And so we've got two projects underway. One is aimed at sort of understanding the audience proposition. What will attract people? What is the best editorial, journalistic audience play for public media in these local markets? Because there's lots of different choices that you can make, and it's very hard for individual properties to figure that out one by one. So we're trying to provide some guidance there and have a project underway in 12 different markets that actually launched today with the signing of a contract with the CPB around that will be attempting to, in essence, do rapid prototyping over the next 2 years of some local news sites in those markets. The other sort of trailing behind that, but began with what Eugene referred to as the NPR API, is an effort to create a common platform and think about networking public media content, however that's ultimately defined, in some sort of common repository. The larger goal of which is to encourage the kind of innovation that needs to go on at the local level to, in essence, stimulate open source development on top of that repository and give people the tools with which to invent the next generation of news gathering. So one piece is sort of intellectually focused on what the audience proposition is, the other very much on infrastructure and platform and common standards and economies of scale. So.
In a way that sounds almost, just striking me now that the analogy to what might be the collected assets of public media made available through an open platform is the data.gov proposition, where then you hope and in fact encourage further innovation to happen on top of that collected content. And then the sources of that content, unlike not being government sources, this is where I think the conversation gets interesting, is when you're talking about the first incarnation of the platform, thinking about NPR content or the related partners, national producers. But then we might get to where Sue's purview into a much broader range of individual creators or others who are not necessarily holders of licenses to bits of spectrum. So one question that I would like anybody to jump in on, go through, first is, as we think about this transition, we've talked about a few of the assets already that we bring forward with it, existing knowledge and expertise even in storytelling and this mediation role. Some powerful relationships, community organizations across the country that are already in place and providing valued service over broadcast. One of the ones also that is interesting in contrast to the declining trust in other institutions nationally, government, Congress being examples that were just brought up, is the trust in public media brands, the ones that are best known, is actually very high and in many ways growing. But what, if you were looking at it, and the two of you who are newest to the system, as we call the system, might have particular insight in this, are the hindrances? We have, you can mention another asset that maybe I didn't mention that we're bringing in, but what are the ones that you actually see as obstacles to public broadcasting playing a fundamental role in the new space?
All right.
You guys got it.
Yeah. I think there are two that I would cite. I think one of the, Rita, you were talking about one of the great one of the great assets of public broadcasting is localism, and I think one of the great challenges of public broadcasting is localism, meaning that we have 800 plus independent businesses with their own boards, with their own balance sheets, with their own infrastructure that can work together and have the opportunity to work together, but sometimes it's hard. So you have uneven distribution of capacity, whether it's a small little radio station done by 2 people in Marfa, Texas, to GBH or some of the larger producing stations. So I think that's one of the big challenges, and I think CPB's role in that challenge, as well as NPR and PBS and all the other big organizations, is to start to make some systematic wide investments in things that Kinsey was talking about in terms of public media platforms. And another project I would cite, which would be one that I'm working on, is called the American Archive, which is not a news-based archive, though I think Eugene's point about helping and trying to help improve the ability for people to get access to journalism content is very important. The American Archive is a much larger archive than just journalism, and we have to understand that public media is something that is very much involved in education and arts and cultural life. And it's amazing, actually. I have a little thing right now for the American Playhouse, if anyone remembers that. I just got a book with all of the American Playhouse productions, and it's every significant actor, producer, writer, or director in today's Hollywood scene has over the age of 35, has created content for the American Playhouse series, like every single one. And they didn't do it for commercial interests. They didn't even really do it for themselves. They did it for the American public. But it's hard to get access to that material because of the myriad rights issues. So I think if I was going to talk a little bit about some of the big challenges, it's that question of how do you even capacity? And I think technology infrastructure, equal access to very robust, flexible technology infrastructure, whether it's something that is put together by an NPR or PBS working together, or whether it's something put together by outside entities like Google or Cisco or whatnot, are very important, as well as this addressing of this digital rights issue. The American public has made significant investments in this fantastic stuff, but you know what? You can't get access to it.
Just on the obstacle side, I guess, to build on what Rob was saying, as I look at sort of this transformation over the last 15 years, over and over again, you see that the organizations that have the greatest difficulty are those whose legacy structure, governance, whatever, profoundly inhibits their ability to sort of make this transition, to take the risks, to make the investments that they need to, because their loyalties are divided, or structurally they're simply not set up and organized to do this. And clearly that's one of the challenges that public media faces. I'm quite optimistic, though, and particularly having come out of the newspaper industry and having watched what occurred there. Public media is generally operating from a position of strength. Public radio's audience has grown 67% between 1998 and 2008, while programming, most other news programming has declined on other platforms, traditional legacy platforms. We are not rocked back on our heels as we're trying to make this transformation. We actually enjoy trust, reach, a vibrant news organization, and can build from there, and I think have become aware of the necessity of moving quickly at a time when we're still strong. And that, unfortunately, newspapers, when their cash flow was at its zenith in 2002, 2003, were not as quick to act and are now finding it very difficult to respond to the technological challenges that they face.
Could I respond?
Yeah, go ahead.
Even though I'm not.
I would just add one sort of another dimension to what Kinsey is saying here. In terms of the legacy and the culture, a public radio is an institution that is a phenomenal success story. I mean, it's a 35-year-old institution that has basically just had straight growth in audience, in revenues, and in penetration, and just evolving into the very respected institution that it is. it boils down to the people and an understanding that the people who started this whole enterprise 35 years ago are in large part still the ones who are with it. They've ridden this wave. They're the architects of success. And here they are at a point at this incredibly, this time where there's this tremendous seismic shift going on. And what they were hired to do and what they did extremely well was build this, this amazing institution. And now suddenly they're supposed to somehow, change everything or help it through this whole transformation. And I think it's a really basic kind of awareness that we have to have that they did their job. It's not their job to necessarily come up with the transformation. The answer to the transformation and the agency of transformation isn't those who are sort of holding the keys to the kingdom. So there needs to be a very sort of, it's kind of simple, but it's a powerful kind of awareness that needs to happen within the institution. And I don't think our industry is alone. I'm sure this happens, all the time with industries that enjoy tremendous success. It's really hard for those gatekeepers who did their job and they did it extremely well, and who are sort of looking at, retirement. They're moving out. How to make that transition. The other thing I would just add quickly is that related to this is there's a tremendous gap in infrastructure and investment. We have this legacy at this institution that is under siege with the economy, and tremendous amount of money being pushed into it to keep it shored up, to keep the lights going, to keep the electricity on, at a time when we have such a need, again, of this nimble kind of risk-taking energy and enterprise. And there's a real gap in the infrastructure and how we actually fund that, how we actually make that happen in dollars and cents.
So, Rob, go ahead and jump in. I wanted to hear from you and then also from Rita in the parallel of assets versus obstacles. The fundamental piece of the architecture of public broadcasting is a local station, a local entity. And there's a lot of ways of thinking around and beyond that, but what is that role going forward?
Yeah, that's actually where I was going to follow up. I think there's a couple of things to be said. I mean, again, I want to reiterate, I came from the digital media world where I had no ability to transmit, and now I'm working in public broadcasting where we do have the ability to transmit. And that's a really incredibly efficient thing to do. You build a tower and you sink some costs into that, but the cost of adding more clientele to get that signal is pretty much zero. The cost to transmit to one is a cost to transmit to 1 million. And that is not true. That's not the same scale in digital media. And so those local institutions, all of those local organizations are truly these amazing anchor institutions in their community. They have the ability to collaborate and to curate. They have the ability to work with the local community in new ways and provide content and broadcast into schools, into healthcare clinics, into people's homes. And so I think that before we give up on the infrastructure that we spent the last 35 years building, we should realize that there's still a lot of energy and a lot of power in that. And that infrastructure is tied to staff on the ground, as Marita said, in every community in the country, including Marfa, Texas, where there are 2 dedicated people out there trying to tell the public story. And I think that's a really important, a really important point. I think just lastly, in terms of localism and stations, there is a transformation that's going on in those stations. We have to balance really savvy media executives who understand how to run a media operation with people like me, who are coming in and who've never run a broadcast media operation and who understand how to do new things in new ways. And there's that balancing point that's important.
Rita?
I am, so wrapped up in the notion that our stations are the opportunity we have to provide for voice in our community at a scale that's not really available to us in many other instances. And I find this when I'm dealing with partnerships now with people inside and outside traditional public broadcasting. That question of voice to me is one thing I hope we don't see at risk, as we move toward new ways of engaging with the public. And it's one of the real opportunities I see. Certainly in a local community, with the tools that we have now, we're finding as a station that this is when we can go to Dorchester. This is when we can stop talking about, populations in our community who have no way to talk to us, to themselves. I think becoming the vehicle for that kind of dialogue and shared information is very exciting to me. It's very exciting because we can do more of that now than we used to be able to do. And I see that with our local television, our Basic Black that's suddenly doing live programs, but the dialogue is right online, that they're community video reporters, that they're bloggers. We look at some of what we call the lab open calls, which we're doing locally, and then nationally, which are calls for people to upload video, to really participate in the dialogue that's being addressed through the other platforms. So I would say that the ability for those local stations to continue to partner with organizations outside of themselves is critical.
So I want to move from the broadcast portion of the event to the participatory portion of the event. So if you have questions, again, please go to the microphones on the side. And also, if you're watching the stream, I did manage to get online. And if you want to tweet a question in, or one-upping the panel before us, we're going to iterate. So just tweet me, Jake Shapiro, just at Jake Shapiro, and hopefully I'll see you here on the direct message. While we're gathering at the microphones, I wanted to ask this a question about the business model as a strength. So we've often describing limited resources of public broadcasting and the strains between the undercapitalization of the tax-funded dollars and the strains that public television in particular has to do around pledge and underwriting and sponsorship. But in some ways, and Kinsey, you were sort of alluding to this, that diversified business model and certainly the direct reliance and relationship we have with people pledging money to support something that they value could be seen as a strength. Do you see that actually as something that is something that we not only should carry forward but map beyond what we've done so far?
I think it not only could be seen as a strength, I'm increasingly come to appreciate just how essential our diversified revenue model is to our independence, to our ability to be able to report without fear or favor, and to being able to weather the kind of technological disruption that we're going through now. Again, having come from commercial media, one of the things that you're seeing happen right now is the extreme dependence on advertising revenue really drives all conversations at a moment like this, where revenues are declining, where they're trying to make adjustments in the business, and we're fortunate in having a relatively even mix between, in the case of NPR, it's about 28% of our revenue comes from corporate sponsorship. A little under 50% comes from licensing, which at the station level comes from listener support. And then
licensing meaning state fees the stations pay for the programming.
Right. And then the remainder from foundation and gifts, and a very small proportion in our case comes from the federal government. So that may change over time. How that business model translates in the digital era remains to be seen. We've got a lot of ideas about how that can happen, but it is absolutely a source of strength. Let's start with the microphone on the left. Please introduce yourself to me.
Eric Wolf from PBS, actually. But this is actually more of a personal question, personal background. Eugene, in his talk, talked about the notion of public media as a source of social cohesion, I think, or societal cohesion. The media today is more and more fragmented, right? The right listens to Fox, the left listens to MSNBC, somebody else listens to CNN. People go into their corners and listen to what they want to hear. Can you all talk about how you see, and Marita, I think you just started to maybe touch on this, how you see public media being having an opportunity to provide societal cohesion as we get into a more and more fragmented world?
Yeah, we work hard not to be put in a box. And I think it's essential that we maintain that as we move forward. If there's any box we're trying to get out of, it's the tone of voice box. It's the creative box. It's the grammar box. I
don't know what you're talking about.
That's a different box from the how we are being viewed. And I think this point about being trusted purveyors of information is core. because as media proliferates, yes, you've got 5 different, 6 different, 10 different things you're looking for. We need to make sure that public media, public broadcasting remains one of your 5 choices, if that's what you have. And people will I think, respond to that as the cacophony goes on. So our role is to think about how we invite the participation, how we invite the development of shared space with other communities, so that it isn't all just us talking, but really providing the space for those communities to talk to one another. We attract people, but they have no way to talk to one another. And if we agree with the view that intelligence has been passed out evenly among communities, rich, poor, ethnic, transmediate, whatever, national, part of our role is to convene those people who want to bring intelligence to bear on some of the many issues in front of us. And I think that role for us is becoming more possible because of the tools that we have at hand.
Nolan Bowie again. I'm a former public interest communications lawyer, longtime advocate for public broadcasting. I support both public broadcasting stations here in Boston. I say that as background. As we all know, not all media are regulated in the same manner by government. Broadcasting is much more deeply and widely regulated than all other media. What makes broadcasting different is the legal fiction of spectrum scarcity, the so-called scarcity rationale. Justice Clarence Thomas, in a concurring decision this summer in August, released in a case titled FCC versus Fox, more or less invited a challenge to the broadcast regulation based on an attack on First Amendment grounds. And
First Amendment grounds.
In the Citizens United, the court seems to treat the First Amendment as sacrosanct, almost as if it was absolute. The same rationale, if applied to broadcasting, would probably hold this court would hold broadcasting regulation as being unconstitutional. I'd like to ask the panel in general to regard a more consistent way of regulating broadcasting, consistent with First Amendment goals and principles, what they think. Should broadcasting not be regulated as a common carrier? First come, first served, non-discrimination, no censorship, and a separation of the owners of the stations or the conduit from content to give everyone an equal opportunity to speak.
Who wants to jump in on that one?
I'd like to phone a friend.
This is your chance to phone a friend. I know you have some friends in the audience, Rob. So.
I can try. It's the least person. I mean, I'm no policy person at all. I mean, just very briefly, from a broadcaster standpoint, we have an 11% penetration into the American public, and we do that, by virtue of what we put out. We reflect who we attract as an audience, and I think it's clear that we have a tremendous opportunity now in this age that we're in to penetrate beyond the 11%. And I think we're all committed to doing that and finding ways to do that using, again, the momentum that we have going right now to reflect a more broadly a democratic, more colorful and diverse America. I think that I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but could we do that?
With a 1-watt radio station, you can reach a global audience.
Right. So is the question in a way, when the transition starts and public media is serving perhaps equally or even more so through digital channels, that the broadcast that it retains, the spectrum that it retains, should be managed differently than it's currently managed? So that we should actually, one stations perhaps are primarily now serving audiences through digital platforms. Then the existing spectrum that we've operated in a certain programming approach, you're suggesting perhaps might be operated differently.
You still have the First Amendment to contend with.
Right. I'm going to switch to the next topic because I don't think anybody here is ready to jump in. Kinsey, you ready? Okay.
Hi, I'm Stefan Demessier. I'm the director of Citizens Market. We're a new nonprofit in Boston, and we're interested in connecting consumers with information about corporate behavior, both large companies and small local companies. My question is really for any of the panelists. We've heard a lot of really interesting things today about how communities engage the public sector, but since you have your ear down to the ground with what communities are doing, I wonder if you have any interesting stories about changes in how communities are engaging the private sector. This might be local plants from large companies or also local companies themselves. Have you seen any shifts or interesting things happening in that area? Thanks.
You know, actually, Kinsey, I wouldn't mind prompting where NPR, I mean, I think there's a big focus on accountability journalism. Seems to be the next area where a lot of public media stations are thinking about investing even more resources. And I'm wondering, as not necessarily from NPR or from NPR, what you see about that.
I mean, I think there's a huge opportunity at sort of the intersection of data and journalism, if you will. And that's one of the focuses of, where we're starting to put some energy into investigative reporting and accountability journalism. I was involved in a project, actually, my former employer at USA Today, where we did very elaborate mapping of the point emissions from manufacturing concerns all over the country, and they have to report to the EPA. But the data that comes out is virtually unintelligible. I mean, you get information about each individual emitter, but you can't draw a picture of what's happening environmentally on the ground. And we worked with the University of Massachusetts to divide the country up into 1-by-1 squares and look at what the actual impact was, and look at prevailing winds, and look at the cumulative total of that, and then mapped it against proximity to schools, because that's where young kids are for extended periods of the day. And it drew a very different picture of, it took government information on the one hand that was publicly available, but for all intents and purposes not actionable in any way, and transformed it into something that provided a series of stories around at an individual moment, but actually lives on today and is a continuing resource for those communities to use, and is a way for them to hold individual corporations accountable. So I think it's just one example of a different brand of stories, if you will, that we can start developing over time.
Yeah, and I would actually add two more very quickly. One is a lot of focus, well, not a lot, but there's increasing focus on hyper-localism in terms of journalism. Mentioned Every Block, that ostensibly came from public media, and then went out through the Knight Foundation, and then went into the private sector. But there are other examples of hyper-localism where they're trying. In Philadelphia, WHYY, Chris Satullo, who's running this project, is one of the premier civic engagement journalists in the country. Ran the editorial page at the Inquirer, and worked with the city on helping them structure the budget process with community engagement. And he's trying to apply those same lessons to working with 7 neighborhoods in Philadelphia around how do you get the community to work on both commercial and government solutions to building that community to be a better place. And I think another one I would cite is Lens on Atlanta, which is a project that's out of Atlanta PBS. It's focused on Public Broadcasting Atlanta, I should say, which is focused on trying to give a platform to citizens to talk about everything as mundane as in, like, why is there this huge pothole in my street, to what's happening in my community and why I don't like it. What is the great part about that, I think what's the sort of the brilliant part, is that Milton Clipper and the folks at PBA are using their journalistic cred to take those stories and those conversations and turn them into questions from a journalistic point of view. It's almost in some ways crowdsourcing community engagement into journalism versus the other way around, and asking, so why is there a pothole in this street, or why, store, are you doing these things? So I think those are examples where we're getting a lot of experimentation. What we need to do now is invest in what works and start to build capacity throughout the system.
So we have another question coming over here on the right. You wanted to jump in? So please go ahead. We'll do one more question, and I have one tweet that's come in that I'll pass along.
I can't compete with a tweet. Hi, my name is Danielle Martin. I'm here from MIT, from the Urban Studies and Planning Department, but I'm also from the community media and the youth media world. And I know this come up a couple times that there's a difference between a mediated and an unmediated space, but I wonder if folks on the panel had some opinions about, is there a leadership role that public media, as is defined by who's sitting at this panel here, could play in, getting people to use more social media and community media like public access stations and collective enterprises that aren't quite as mediated, to have there be more public interest and more legitimacy to those endeavors?
I think that's a great question. I mean, it ties a bit to a phrase that Eugene had used, which is this vision of a new public media network, which I think implies a more expansive sense of who we are beyond perhaps the entities constituted here, hopefully partnering with and actually helping showcase and elevate some of the groups that are doing amazing work in other domains, where some of both the audience reach, the platform and technology, some of the journalistic skills and training that can come with it really could help, I think, raise up a much broader segment than we've seen to date. Let me throw it to you guys to talk about where you see that as the opportunity. I mean, what is the vision of the new public media network?
I mean, a lot of some of that is what we think about when I was talking about World 2.0, and I really think about it as partnerships with groups outside of ourselves who themselves are creating community, to really look at individual. Youth Media of Oakland comes to mind just because you talked about young people, but
Youth Media, right?
Youth Media, who would partner with us on this, or the guys at Bayback or One Economy, or there are people we talk to whose own work could be expanded and exposed and could attract more people because we're partnering. In that case, they're the authorities, not the public broadcaster. The public broadcaster has the platform and the opportunity to really bring more people to the question. But I'm imagining that the kinds of things we could get back are going to be pretty tremendous. Even in our smaller efforts at WGBH, kind of the open lab, open call we did with a NOVA program attached to an Adobe Youth program, to really come back and talk about heat and climate change. And I always find that in those sorts of partnerships, the kind of questions, the approach, the perspectives, the whole thing is much enriched. And I see us doing more of that, and not less. I think we're moving in that direction.
So as a segue for Sue, maybe to jump in that question, the tweet that came in was asking you about how do you recruit new producing talent?
Asking me that question?
Yeah.
Well, over the last 2 years, we've had a 22% increase in growth in the organization, and over the last 9 months or so, we've begun to actually survey these people to say, who are you and why are you coming to us? And I'll answer that question in a second, but just to give you some insight and maybe to respond to that question a bit, is what we're seeing emerge is 67% of the new members coming are under the age of 34. 55%, we're an organization of independents in radio. 55% are primarily oriented to broadcast radio, but we're seeing this growth in online orientation. 30% of the new members coming in are oriented to online. And then there's subcategories of print and other sort of forms of media. So in other words, 25% are non-Caucasian. So we're seeing emerge, I think it's I interpret it as kind of reflective of the larger world of people who are, again, taking tools into their own hands. And I would say that they lead us, as Marita is suggesting, they sort of have the power to lead us to these other places and these other collaborations and partnerships. And the opportunity, and exciting opportunity, is, for, again, how we create the pathway for this group into the legacy institutions. The tweet, in terms of recruitment, it's sort of viral. It's sort of, I think it's very much word of mouth with our organization. The MQ2 project, it was a competitive call out to producers to get grant money, so we reached far and wide.
It always helps to offer grant money.
Yeah.
The recruiting technique,
yeah.
if you can offer some funding.
Offer money, that's a good recruitment tool.
So we're winding down, and I thought I would give a chance for the panelists to offer some closing comments. One of the things that we didn't really get to touch much on, but has been interesting as it's bubbled up elsewhere, is that part of the landscape that's really exploded over the last number of years as we've been observing the media transition are these other platforms. We're talking about building a public media platform, but here we are with YouTube and with Facebook and with Twitter, clearly enabling a huge amount of public participation, of distribution, of a lot of things that, when public broadcasting was created 40 years ago, we felt was actually the a thing that was missing that we needed to address. Those circumstances have changed. Where do you see, as you think through on the positive side of public media's leadership role in this, where we need to be creating that capacity and where we're really hoping to leverage others who are building those platforms? So
just briefly, I'd just say, 5 years ago, February, YouTube launched, and Huffington Post launched 5 years ago, not this month, but recently. And you see the acceleration of those platforms is incredible. I mean, I have an 8-year-old, and so they're only 5 years old. Can you imagine when they get really dangerous? I think that the challenge is for public media to work outside of itself and start to innovate with these technology companies and young people and collaborate. And it's a very exciting time right now because public media in large measure is excited to do that. So this is going to be a critical couple of years. And in fact, I have to give some kudos to Eugene and the rest of the folks at FCC who are really very thoughtfully trying to engage public broadcasting in this work. So,
one of the things that struck me coming into public radio is the extraordinary loyalty of the audience and the level of trust and the extent to which people not only have an affinity for what we do as broadcasters but potentially for each other. And it is, in a sense, a latent network, if you will, of people who imagine that they have something in common with others who listen and shared experience, most of which we've not yet succeeded in bringing online. The opportunity in the platforms that you mentioned is to do precisely that and to recognize that our job is to make sure that we're connecting people and that we're getting information in front of them wherever they're consuming information. We've seen a shift just in the last year as the percentage of referral traffic that's coming in from a variety of different quarters. Search is still the highest, but RSS used to be second, and now it's social media that has displaced RSS. So you're moving from sort of a more mechanical distribution platform to one that's based more on individuals and networks. And I think that's only going to accelerate. So.
And I see these, these are tools for us. That our work is really our work, which has to do with voice and connection and education and dialogue. And these are tools, and the more of them, the better. I mean, it's really how do I use YouTube, and if it's Facebook, how do we use Facebook? So we're content creators, and we're engaged now in serious partnerships with people who are, as I said, very much outside public broadcasting. With our publics, and that's what the excitement is. And I think where we can use whatever's out there, how we adapt and how we structure our content to fit that particular framework, that's fine. That's kind of why we're in the business. And I find the partnerships to do that have been very, I work with everybody at this table, or Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PRX, AIR, NPR, PBS. I mean, there are not that many of us out here. So we're running hard, and I think are happy to feel that we're now part of a much larger community of people who are also running hard. So bring on the YouTubes.
Bring on the YouTubes. Okay, well, we'll close, I suppose, with that. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you everybody here. Thank you, Chris.
I want to thank the FCC team, especially Kevin, Vishal, and Eugene, who had to work with us in Harvard in organizing this, always a difficult task. Domestically, thinking within the Center for Future Civic Media, Christina Shih, Andrew Whitaker, Brad Sewell, and most of all, Lori Lejeune, who's trying to hide back there. But our new program director did a great job of organizing this. But I guess probably the biggest thanks have to go to the people who pay all those salaries, which in large part is the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which endowed the Center for Future Civic Media, to which we're really grateful for, and have been playing leadership roles on many, many areas. One point that I'll make, because we talked a little bit about free and open software earlier, one of the conditions of the News Challenge, which was the grant that endowed us and many others, was that the people who are doing this work, software for community news and engagement, would have to open their source code. And I can just say that that was incredibly useful because it's a very difficult thing to do at MIT. Universities labor under the idea that they're going to make money off of IP, and a couple of them have. But the regime makes it very difficult for our students in some cases to open source or do their projects in free software ways, which is an incredibly powerful way. It's unusual for a foundation to be such a thought leader that they would demand that of their recipients, when it's actually still a very young field. But another area that they've played an important role in is understanding and doing experiments in broadband access. They've had many major projects in the field. And have done some great studies on it, all with reference to their greater understanding of the information needs of communities and democracies. So let me introduce Damien Thorman, who's the National Program Director for NITE, with some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Chris. You didn't tell me it was going to be cold here in Boston, so. Let me be quick because I'm the last thing between you and dinner. First of all, NITE believes, obviously, that democracy, I think probably would agree with most of you, that democracy is the last, is moving to the internet. And because it is moving to the internet, that we believe that we have to invest in opening up the internet to everyone, because if, as democracy moves to the internet, if everyone doesn't have access to the internet, then people are disenfranchised from democracy. We've decided to make a major investment in universal broadband. Our founders, Jack and Jim Knight, were newspapermen. They were both also community builders. And they realized that information was vital to our communities. Each day they delivered news and information that helped people decide their own true interest, as Jack Knight used to say. Today, at the Foundation, we carry that belief into the digital age. Our ideal is to inform and engage communities. To that end, we've spent $400 million since 1950 advancing quality journalism and freedom of the press. Perhaps more telling is that in the last 3 years, we've spent over $100 million in media innovations. Our signature investment in this area, as Chris mentioned, is the Night News Challenge. Our winners range from David Cohen, a 20-something journalist and entrepreneur who has come up with a model for having the public pay for investigative reporting, to Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web. Another innovative and also initiative looked at information needs nationally to come up with suggestions on national media policy. The effort began with a meeting 3 years ago at the Aspen Institute to take a look at the massive changes in the media industry. Now, this was before the recession and ensuing media bankruptcies, and even before the national conversation on digital access. It was obvious, even before that these things that were going wrong with the information flows to communities, that we need to do something. Because our country is based on the free flow of information, we realized that democracy and media was in danger. While the digital age was creating a communications renaissance, it was not, and still is not, serving all Americans in the local communities. In partnership with the Aspen Institute, we decided to launch the Knight Commission on Information Needs in a Democracy to suggest a way forward. The Commission was given a deceptively simple charge. First, to articulate the information needs of a democracy. Second, to describe the state of things in the United States. And third, to propose public policies, directions that would help lead us from where we are today to where we ought to be. Rather than focusing on media, the Knight Commission centered on communities and the information people needed, and work backward from there. I think this is important to recognize because often as people see and look to us as the former Knight newspaper chain, people often say or suppose that we are about propping up or supporting newspapers, and it's actually nothing further could be. We are about providing news and information and supporting communities in what they need to engage in what would the Knight brothers, and particularly Jim Knight, talked about, bestirring people to act in their own true self-interest. And so newspapers were a vehicle to do that. So as we look to invest and engage our communities, we don't look at newspapers, we look at different information news flows, and that's a whole ecosystem of news and information and investments. The result, the first major report on news and information in the digital age, offers a vision for creating news and creating informed and engaged communities into the future. It holds 15 ideas from championing news literacy in the public schools to making public libraries centers for digital training and access. It talks about creating public broadcasting that is more local, more interactive, and building city hall websites that actually make public information easy to understand. And I'm happy to see that we heard a lot about all those ideas today. But the key recommendation is that America needs universal and affordable access. So I would just, this is the report. It's if you're interested, you can get this from the Knight Foundation. It's on our website, and you can. It's at knightfoundation.org. It's available digitally, and we'd be happy to get you a hard copy as well. What is the role of government in this? We believe that the government should approach this problem like the Eisenhower administration or the Lincoln administration did in their day. They understood that the need to connect the nation by using the latest technology. In the middle of the Civil War, the Lincoln administration used the transcontinental, they used the railroad to link the East and the West and through commerce and by developing the transcontinental railroad. After World War II, the Eisenhower administration built the interstate highway system connecting the nation by car and truck. Lincoln did not ask if people traveled for pleasure by commerce, and Eisenhower did not care whether you drove a Cadillac or a Ford. They cared that the nation be connected, and that's the lesson we can learn today. Yet, we are also realistic. We know that the United States is a vast country and wide-ranging needs, and there's tremendous gaps in access. We also know that the problem doesn't just stop with access, that we need to improve digital literacy, and that every American can engage and use the internet to improve lives. We're also looking to invest in ideas that engage people in new and dynamic ways through community engagement initiatives, so that people, like many of the projects we heard about in some of the panels, can really connect and engage people more fully in their we call community process. And with all due deference, we believe government is an important partner, but we don't think it's the only partner. And so we don't use the word civic, we use community because we believe it's a more inclusive term. We believe that public-private partnerships are critical, and we continue to work very closely with the FCC on a whole range of initiatives, as well as a number of other state and local government partners. And in fact, a week from tomorrow, we are sponsoring, along with the FCC, the National Broadband summit on adoption. We welcome each of you to attend either through webcast or in person. You can go on the NITE website or the FCC website to find out more. The website for the actual summit is DigiSummit, D-I-G-I summit.org, or it is available on the homepage of both the FCC website and the Knight Foundation website. It will, like today, the chairman will be there and my boss will be there to talk about some of the recommendations around adoptions. And there were some very good questions earlier about adoption. They'll lay out many of the answers and for the first time at that summit. And we're very excited to be hosting that along with the FCC. I'll just briefly end with a few of the things that the Knight Foundation is doing. We're trying to make investments, and as Chris indicated, we have made a number of important investments. Knight Foundation works primarily in 8 communities, but we have 26 communities that we have traditionally worked with. And we have made investments where we're trying to model and trying to connect communities and provide universal access. We have a very strong partnership in Miami, our home community, where we have funded a broadband coalition, bringing together a number of players from the public schools to library systems to healthcare agencies, coming together to try to figure out how they can create universal access that will provide a number of services for the community and expand services into at-risk communities and libraries. We also are working in Detroit to provide a targeted broadband network for an inner-city community. We are providing universal access in Akron, Ohio, where we hope to actually make a very substantial portion of Akron completely digital, universal access for the whole city. And we have worked in Philadelphia to try to help build the local collaborations there, and we hope to continue that work. We're working, and we will continue to work in all of our communities to try to expand access. Obviously, a very important area. And we're continuing our work on adoption. We've worked with Ray Ramsey and others at One Economy, and we'll continue that work. I just want to thank MIT for the great work, Chris, and all your folks and the FCC. That's been a very challenging topic you've taken on today, but an important one. Except for the slight that Eugene made about attorneys, it's been quite an enjoyable afternoon. It really is an important topic. I would be remiss to say, that I think it's important for all of us to remember that this is the beginning of the process, not the end, and that the FCC on March 17th will be laying out the formal proposal to Congress, and that it then starts the process in many ways, and that we have to remember that the public and a lot of folks have to get out, and there's an important role for everybody in this room, everyone listening, to go out and to work in the communities. And then there is only so much that the government can do, and even if the government did everything it could on March 17th, which it won't, but even if it did, this really has to happen in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and so we all have to take our own cues and do our own part. And the Knight Foundation stands ready to try to do our part as a philanthropy to try to invest and to spur innovation as much as we can. And so we thank you for the opportunity to be here today and look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you very much.